Okay, what I'd like to do, and I guess participants will see this afterwards, is I'll provide some personal reflections of my journey and thoughts coming to this role in IPBES through the various assessments. Now I'm chairing the platform, which is a great honor to do, to try and have impact from it and relate to what you're dealing with in the course, which is about transformative change and the realization of how much we need to go through transformative change to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and our sustainability objectives in the future. I'm very conscious coming in late like this and on my own in a way that you have many leaders in IPBES with you. I know you have Christiana, of course, Carlos Jolie is in the program. You've had a couple of co-chairs of assessments, Eduardo Brontizio, and you've had Karen O'Brien as well, and many participants in assessments and transformative change assessment. So I'll not try and cover the technical work which we go through, because I think they will have given you a lot more detail, but a bit more my own personal journey coming from coastal zones in Kenya, in East Africa, and looking at coral reefs. Now, I think you'll all know a lot about the various assessments that we produced. This was the global assessment we produced in 2019, which is really IPBES's signature assessment until now. And like all the assessments, we really try and deal with specific aspects of the state of nature, how it supports people, and IPBES has developed this conceptual framework which explains how we use and value nature to contribute to our good quality of life through direct drivers, the box on nature itself, the nature's contributions to people. And these are a key contribution of IPBES to the scientific community to classify the ways in which we benefit from nature, whether materially or through non-material benefits as well, and through regulatory contributions to people. Also, we look at how these contributions support global goals in biodiversity. So these are the HE targets on top, which the global assessments assessed. And now, of course, we have the global biodiversity framework and the sustainable development goals. And then really an understanding that all pathways to future sustainability really involve transformative pathways. It's now clear. This graph on the right shows projections into the future of the state of nature, and the business as usual curve, bottom in gray out to 2100, is projected to bottom out eventually. And conservation actions done to the greatest ambition, conservation and restoration actions in yellow, don't get us back to where we were at the start of this analysis at that point zero where the red line is. And we really need transformations in production and consumption in order to enable a better state for nature in the future that also supports people in a better way. Now, I've been approaching this a lot through coastal communities in Kenya, as I said, and really using the Sustainable Development Goals, which I think are a fantastic hypothesis or model of sustainability. And I think while they were developed for national and international frameworks, they really have their greatest benefit at local levels. And this is some work that I did starting about 4 or 5 years ago, and we're continuing now, is really trying to express the lives of local communities through the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So there in the middle, you can see a couple, Hamisi and Mariam. He's a fisherman, she's a market seller, and amongst other things. And you can express the local economy or the local situation, the reef, the environment, how benefits are shared amongst different stakeholders, the governance in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it makes it very real for people to understand, rather than the goals being very remote. And I think this is very important for understanding pathways to transformation, especially ones that are accessible to people and that can be actioned. Now in IPBES, we've developed this conceptual framework, which is very strong academic and technical expression of how people benefit from nature and how we impact on nature. And this was developed through several years of consultations through many different stakeholders, the scientists, indigenous peoples and local communities as well, governance or government representatives also, to synthesize relationships into these 6 boxes. Now, this can be related quite well, I think, to the sustainable development paradigm through the 3 pillars of sustainability. And that's quite, I think this is perhaps an easier framing to communicate with people, how we look at the interactions between nature, economy, and society. And then the various boxes and arrows in the IPBES conceptual framework, either in those 3 boxes or else in the arrows leading from direct uses of nature into economic activities, which provide societal benefit, and then the indirect and direct drivers leading back down to nature and the impacts we have on natural systems. And these can be expressed, of course, in more detail with more nuances in the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are many different authors, so different research groups have looked at different ways to package the Sustainable Development Goals. And I've come to look at them through the lens of IPBES conceptual framework and this nature, economy, society buckets or bins in this way, really, rather than trying to express, a theory of change about how we value nature or different societal perspectives, really just looking at the interactions, the physical interactions as we extract resources from nature, we use them in economic sectors. These benefit people in different ways. And then at the top there are really the governance or the means of implementation and the knowledge that we apply in governing this overall system. And what's useful about this, I think, is that in trying to think about change and transformations and how we shift from the pathways we're on, we need to identify key narratives for development and what drives the storyline, and to open this up to different stakeholder groups and different perspectives. So I think one key element, thinking about transformation and the aspect that I'm sure you've engaged with a lot in the course and all will in your work moving forward, is the issue of equity and inequalities. Not just so I'll back up a bit. We've tended to look at the direct drivers of economic activity on nature, so natural resource extraction, energy use, the direct uses to the economy, who that money and or the resources are going to. But if we just focus on those direct interactions, we're not quite getting the whole story. And I think this is no surprise to any of you there. But I think it's about trying to reframe these narratives. And so moving into the Anthropocene now, we have heard about this being developed through the narrative of the Great Acceleration, all of the drivers increasing of nature's decline. But we're increasingly talking about the great inequality now. And I think this is perhaps the way in which we can really shift the discourse and actually change what's happening. Inequality can be shown in many different ways. This example is just based on carbon dioxide emissions, and it shows from the Climate Inequality Report, 3 different variables or indicators. So for different income levels, looking at global income in the bottom 50, middle 40, and the top 10%. So the relative losses are much greater in red in the bottom 50%. The carbon dioxide emissions are fairly even between the middle 40% and the top 10%. But the assets or the wealth in each of these, of course, follows the opposite pattern, is very low in the bottom. I think to really understand the equity dimensions, it's important to, say, break this out further into deciles or 10 percentile groups of the global income levels. You can see how the carbon dioxide emissions split, so that the poorest 50%, each of those 5 deciles emits a very small proportion each of total carbon dioxide emissions. And of course, if we had more resolution in the data, the pyramid would be even narrower towards the bottom. But then the importance here in thinking about equality is looking at the vulnerability to climate change. And in this case, looking at the red bars. So if you divide the vulnerability in each of those deciles by their contribution to carbon emissions, you see a differential of 156 between sort of the impact inequity between the bottom 5 deciles, each of those, and the richest 10%. And I think this is very useful for trying to think through new narratives in dealing with the great inequality. There's a very rough rule of thumb, which I've encountered before, and that corresponds to this, in which it's, the rule of thumb was written as live like the middle 40% in order to raise welfare in the bottom, or we have to raise welfare in the bottom 50%. But we enable this by reducing consumption and redistribution from the top 10%. And this is a way to really think about not just the drivers of decline, but the social drivers, the underlying causes, the inequalities that drive this. This is another way to look at the great inequality. This is work from looking at cumulative excess resource use between different income groups using high income, upper middle, lower middle, and low income groups from sort of global statistics from 1970 to 2010. And you can see that the high income and now the upper middle income countries are really contributing much greater amounts of excess resource use compared to lower middle, and then the lower income class isn't even visible in this graph. And what expresses this inequality again is that if we see that the net flow of resources from low to high income countries is 80 times greater than the overseas development assistance that moves from high income to low income countries. So a very unequal distribution there. This is also expressed in this recent study on I guess the planetary boundaries and looking at both consumption and production indicators up above. And you can see that this is a cumulative consumption and production across the percent of global population. And the results from this study stated that 30 to 62%, so about 50% of global population consume less than just minimum access levels. So these would be minimum poverty levels, according to some metrics. And that if we tried to meet these minimum access levels for this 50%, it would contribute less than 1% to global total impact. For energy, it's much more, 20%. So that's a much bigger problem that has to be addressed through energy transitions. But also that this impact is equivalent or could be compensated by redistribution from the top 1 to 4% of global consumers. So that's that top 10% up on the top. And really this idea of the great inequality of reducing this inequality, reducing this inequity over time. I think an alternative way to think about it, and this is one that I'm very interested now from a biodiversity point of view, is this idea of returning financial capital to natural capital. How do we finance the work that needs to be done, and how do we identify what needs to be done and how across the global community? And the current situation, if we take these SDG buckets of nature, economy, and society, is we can express this as the nature goals are being very strongly undermined and degraded by economic activity. And a large part of that economic activity, the benefits go to one sector of or one part of society, but not to other parts of society. And so these inequalities are there. Now, the question is, how do we reinvest or return this excess financial capital back into natural capital? And I think that's one of the great questions of transformations that we need to answer in coming years. And of course, redistribution in society so that there's greater equality levels and we can balance these three pillars of sustainable development, of sustainability, and according to various relationships in the IPBES conceptual framework as well. So these are, and so just to finish up, my presentation here really is just to provide some stimulus, I think, from things that you have been hearing about, and to perhaps present a slightly different perspective on them. In IPBES, we are looking at these relationships in two current assessments at the moment. So the Nexus assessment at the bottom is really looking at a lot of the interconnections between 5 elements that cross 6 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so 3 of these elements, climate change, biodiversity, and water, are in the bottom tier there, in the nature tier. We're also looking at food and health systems, and these are expressed as societal benefit areas in the way I've arranged the SDGs on the right. And of course, all those arrows between them go through many of these economy goals in the middle and many interactions to try and understand how to manage integrated or complex challenges through the means of implementation that we have, and you know, that's related to Nexus governance. Now, the transformative change assessment is looking more at the upper levels in these figures. So the underlying causes and the societal values and behaviors. How do we share things between people in the upper tier, the society tier? How do we deal with governance? What knowledge systems do we use? What finance and sort of participation and joint work can we arrange under that means of implementation at the top? So I hope that this sort of touches on some of the things that you have been engaging with through the course. I'll just finish my slide now with this last one, just to point out some of the opportunities to engage with IPBES that you may have in the future. I'm sure some of you are already involved. The IPBES website carries a lot of information, and you can sign up, you can register on the website to receive notifications and alerts of all opportunities to engage with IPBES. There are some coming assessments in which you could engage as authors or fellows, depending on your level of experience. The second global assessment, we had a scoping workshop for it just a week or 2 weeks ago, which was a really engaging time. Eduardo was there as well to help guide from the first global assessment in terms of moving to the second. And we'll really be looking for authors from early 2025 to participate in that. We also have an assessment on spatial planning and connectivity that will also start in early 2025, but will finish just 2 years later in 2027. And then there's the opportunity to review ongoing assessments, and announcements are made about those. We have various task forces, and particularly the one on capacity building is very relevant to any of you that are at the right career stage to participate as fellows. And it's good to look at that task force to see what may be announced there. We have these 2 stakeholder networks for engagement, the open-ended network for IPBES stakeholders. That's a lot for civil society practitioners and NGOs and others. And then for those who are from indigenous groups and local communities, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services would be very appropriate for you. And then we have a lot of communications and an ongoing podcast, which you can find called Nature Insight. And so we really welcome greater engagement, and I'm sure Christiana and those on the course have been a great inspiration to you, hopefully, to join IPBES and to contribute to our various work. And so I look forward to hearing from you. I suppose I may not be able to engage with question and answers right now, but perhaps if there are questions, we could collect some together and I could engage over email with those who are interested. So thank you very much.